Hello and welcome back to Bandwidth Blog on Air, where in this episode we're continuing with part 3 of our listeners' mail feature, where we're answering all of your questions.
Welcome back to Bandwidth Blog on Air. This is episode 11.
Welcome to Bandwidth Blog on Air, the weekly podcast of bandwidthblog.com.
So Lance Efron asks, is there any justification for a smartphone that can cost basically 10% of the price that you pay for a car, or are we just being taken for a ride for the sake of a status electronic?
Well, Lance, I think you're my new best friend, because that's something I ask myself every day working in tech. And to be honest, I think, it's not only South Africans, to be fair. I mean, the prices generally are across the board, unless you're looking at import tax. Obviously, the prices across the board are quite similar for flagship phones. You're not going to find a great deal of difference, and they're usually around the 10k mark, at least in terms of rand. Whether smartphones are really justified for that price, I don't really think so. At the end of the day, they're only doing very small things differently, and ultimately, I'm prepared to pay that price when, let's say, the camera or battery life is really, really stellar. I would put money on the table for that. But I've always thought that the most interesting market in South Africa isn't necessarily the high-end market, it's the mid-market, because that's where a great deal more consumers are going to be buying from. Obviously, the low-end market is particularly saturated in South Africa, but the mid-end market is fascinating here because it's a place where manufacturers continually have to think, what are the best features we can take down to that price without, the end result being the price increasing. And I think that's where the real innovation is, at least for South African consumers, is actually in the mid-range. I always try to stay away from flagships, and if I do want to get my hands on a flagship, it's, in all honesty, it's generally, let's say, the previous generation, if it's on as good a par as the present one, because I don't see the need to spend that much money on a smartphone. If I'm going to invest money in my computing, I would rather invest in a good desktop or laptop workstation. That's where my most high-end work is going to do. My smartphone, for me at least, at the end of the day, is just above that of an accessory. It's just to be able to contact me. I wouldn't like it, but I could deal with the Nokia 3310 as well as I could an LG G4. Prices are across the board, but until we really start seeing some interesting innovation, I've got to be honest with you, that's an open-ended debate there. I don't know where we're going to see that come from, but I don't think we're going to see any big difference in flagship phones. And like I say, I think the better place to watch is the mid-tier market.
I'd actually like to disagree with you there, because most people in this country are buying phones on a 2-year contract. Now, when it comes to a 2-year contract, the price differences between a low-end, mid-range, and a flagship device is not that much. And the reason being is that the carriers subsidize your phone. I agree that if you're going to buy a phone cash, I would probably also look elsewhere and not buy a flagship, because that can cost you 10,000, 12,000 rand depending on the phone. But when it comes to contracts, I really think that it's worth paying that extra 100 rand a month for a flagship phone.
Well, next up we've got a question from Eric Mulder, and Eric asks us, what smartphone has the best audio recording quality? And most flagship smartphones, at least, sort of share the same general specs, and it's going to be 190 kbs recording, and playback will obviously differ depending on what speaker setup and configuration you have. But if we're going to look at audio recording, funnily enough, I'd say one of the best places to look would actually be BlackBerry. Maybe it's not surprising to some people, BlackBerry sort of being built out of the boardroom would have a really great audio recording feature, but I've consistently heard good things about the BlackBerry Passport actually as an audio recording device. I've not used one personally. If you're looking to really break the bank, you could also go for a Marshall London, which is the phone made by Marshall Amplification in the UK. That would probably net you some really great results. But I think ultimately, any flagship device is ultimately going to feature more or less of the same spec. What I would recommend probably is a top tier Galaxy S6 or one of the S ranges would probably be the best facilitator to record really good audio. But then again, smartphones generally always seem to be valued on their recording quality by the accessories that they can work with. And in that regard, I think an iPhone often isn't badly placed if you're able to invest in both the phone and the recording setup. Mizan Suleiman asks us the hard question here. Since the likes of HTC, LG and other Android vendors are increasingly sort of and since Huawei, LG, and HTC are increasingly adopting more iOS-style looks to their devices, why has Apple singularly targeted Samsung as the focus of its patent infringements?
Well, that's actually very simple. As with most things in life, it comes down to money. Now, Samsung is by far Apple's biggest competitor. So, I mean, from Apple's perspective, if you can bring Samsung down a notch, that's a couple of people that might be buying an iPhone instead of a Samsung. Now, the other point to make is that the patent infringement lawsuit has mostly been about software and not hardware. I think, something like a smartphone, the overall design is so generic, you can't really, they don't have a patent for how the thing looks. Now, it's most of the lawsuits have come from software and alleged software, copies. I mean, it really became ridiculous. Luckily, these patent wars are mostly over, but it became ridiculous. At some stage, Apple was suing Samsung because you have to swipe to unlock the phone. I mean, these are, how they were granted those patents in the first place, I have no idea. Luckily, with these lawsuits, Samsung did win a couple of them, and a bunch of these patents were actually thrown out. So Apple lost them because, I mean, these are things that are so inherent to having a smartphone, you can't really go without it. And that's just because of the way people use phones. It's you can equate that to something like Licorice All Sorts. Now, they lost their trademark because people just started calling these sweets Licorice All Sorts. So they don't have a trademark for that anymore. And it's kind of the same thing with several software features. A lot of Apple's software patents has been thrown out, and it's actually happening across the board because people realized. And it's actually happening across the board because all of these committees realize that, these are very, very strange things to have patents on. I mean, for example, Samsung has a patent on its software keyboard that is on the phone, certain button placements and things like that, and that was also thrown out. I mean, all keyboards look the same. To make a very long answer short, I don't think it came down to hardware; it was software, and they were targeting Samsung because of the fact that it's their biggest competitor. Finally, we have a question from Ryan Allen, and he asks, quite a nice question, what is the best smartwatch out there?
Sure. Well, that's one hell of a vibrant question, actually, because we've got so much to pick from. I think it greatly depends on what you want from it ultimately. But let's just talk about what's maybe at the top of people's mind. I mean, the Samsung Gear S, I think, will have quite a good brand recall once it's out, once it's released later this year. I also believe that just from terms of appearance, I think the Huawei watch is probably the most appealing Android Wear smartwatch I've yet seen released. We've not heard anything really about how that's going to perform, so it's difficult to say whether it'll be the best. In terms of best currently,
if I had to put money down for a smartwatch right now, I would undoubtedly buy the Moto 360. Now, it made waves because it was the first round smartwatch, and yes, some people were upset by the flat tire that's at the bottom of the screen, but I still think that's such a classy thing. I mean, I would love to have that on my wrist every day, and the availability in the country is obviously nowhere, but yeah, just in terms of software, all Android Wear smartwatches are exactly the same in terms of usability. So it comes down to design. Which design do you prefer? And I really love the simplicity and the sleekness of the Moto 360. That would be my choice. I also think there's a lot of other options, from LG, Huawei, and ASUS. But that would be my pick.
Well, that's all for our listeners' mail feature. Thank you very much for sending in all your questions. We had a great time answering them, and we greatly enjoyed the thought-provoking discussions that all of them generated. We'd like our show to continue to be driven by you, our listeners, so please continue to send in your questions and we'll answer them throughout the course of our forthcoming episodes. The winner of the Huawei P8 will be revealed on the site at the end of this week. We finished off episode 11 with some time to spare, so we're quickly going to revisit this week's top headlines. In this week's news, Samsung brought back the nostalgic TV set with the Serif TV, Xiaomi launches the Mi 4C, and Apple has already run out of iPhone 6 and 6S stock. So this week, Samsung brought the idea of a stylized TV set back, which is an expensive font-inspired television set which is called the Serif TV. The name itself was actually an overt nod to the television's shape, which is a thick chassis with ledges that jut out from the top and bottom of the screen. When viewed in profile, these serifs give the TV the distinct shape of the capital letter I. Samsung says that the Serif TV will come in 3 models, a large UHD model about 40 inches, a medium-sized Full HD model at 30 inches, as well as a smaller 24-inch set. All of these sets are going to have built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth as well. They're fancy, but they're definitely not cheap. When the 40-inch set hits stores in the UK, Sweden, Denmark and France on November 2nd, it'll cost £1,200. That's around 25,000 Rand. There's also no word yet if these TVs will be hitting the international market at all, but we'll be certain to let you know if we hear anything. Moving onward, a firm that's really not too well known in South Africa, Chinese firm Xiaomi, have launched their latest smartphone in their local market of China in the form of the Mi 4C. Well, that's certainly a name that's going to remind us of Apple's cheap iPhone attempt with the likes of the 5C. The base model Xiaomi Mi 4C specs include a Snapdragon 808 processor with 2GB of RAM and 16GB of storage, which would include a 5-inch 1080p resolution display, 13-megapixel camera with fast detection autofocus, alongside a front-facing 5-megapixel camera. The Mi 4C will sport a 3080 mAh battery and, surprisingly enough, a USB Type-C port. A second variant of the Mi 4C has 3GB of RAM and 32GB of storage. The Mi 4C will arrive sporting the latest Android software and will include a quad-core processor in both variants. While Xiaomi's smartphone range is slated to arrive in South Africa towards the end of this year, it remains to be seen whether the Mi 4C will prove as popular as Apple's iPhone mark. What's certain, though, is that the Mi 4C certainly appears to be a more enticing package at that price point than the likes of the Apple iPhone 5C. Finally, speaking of Apple, the Cupertino firm has officially run out of stock of the iPhone 6s and 6s Plus. This means for consumers who haven't pre-ordered, they won't be able to get one on launch day. This year, surprisingly, it took Apple a couple of extra days to officially run out of stock. But it seems Apple's had more inventory this time around to satisfy the high demand for their flagship smartphone. It remains possible that the iPhone 6s and 6s Plus will break the sales records of their predecessors, both for the upcoming first weekend in stores and in the long run. Presently, online buyers are seeing possible dates for additional stock to become available sometime between September 29th and October 13th. The larger model seems to be a bit more difficult to come by, but is also the one that sells in lesser volumes. For the rest of us who are waiting to get our hands on Apple's latest phone, it looks like you're going to have to wait at a store to get the device on launch date. That's all for this episode of Bandwidth Blog On Air. Thank you very much for joining us, and once again, thank you very much for sending in all your questions. We look forward to our next episode, episode 12, out next week. Be sure to tune in then. You've been listening to Bandwidth Blog On Air, the weekly podcast of bandwidthblog.com.